I am introducing Professor Gereby, who should not be introduced, in fact. He has had a distinguished career. He is now Associate Professor at the Medieval Studies Department of CU in Vienna. He was several times in Oxford, holding the Isaiah Berlin lectures in 2018. He was a Keeley visiting fellow at Wadham College in 2013-14. He was Fulbright teaching fellow at Rutgers in 2004. He taught at the University of Liverpool. And I am skipping here his numerous publications, but he's also a very good friend of mine, which is an important thing, and a brother in arms in working in our Hungarian and now Austrian environment on late antique and medieval philosophy. And I think it's high time that you begin your lecture on the Protevangelium Jacobi. And if I understand about the many aspects of this interesting and very early apocryphon, you will deal with its place in early Christian literature and its anti-Gnostic stance. Thank you. Please begin.
Thank you so much for the introduction, István. We are indeed camarados arm for a very long time, and share a lot of common interests, often debating with each other about interpretations, but also fundamentally being in a consensus about many issues. So what I'm going to talk about today, well, of course, and thank you everybody who sort of who grace this lecture with their presence, and I'm very grateful that you are spending time on listening to this presentation, which is partly probably those of you who are experts in the field. Some of the materials will be well known, but probably there will be some aspects which are less familiar. So I'm going to talk about the Proto-Gospel of James, and this is a kind of journey into the intellectual history of the second and partly to the third century. So the starting question is, why is the Byzantine iconographic tradition so peculiar? For example, the Kora monastery, early 14th century in Constantinople, or in Castel Seprio in northern Italy and many other places. So there are two distinct traditions of the Nativity, one in the cave and one in the stable. And there are the great ecclesiastical feasts, the 8th of September, the Nativity of the Theotokos, the 21st of November, the presentation of the Theotokos to the temple, and the Roman Catholic feast, the Immaculate Conception of the 8th of December. And in the Apolysis, the dismissal of the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, it is mentioned among the apostles, the martyrs, and the holy fathers, the holy and the righteous ancestors are Joachim and Anna. So all these elements originate from the Proto-Gospel of James, a late 2nd century apocryphon. So the task is to understand the purpose of this apocryphon by trying to decipher the logic and the motives of this text. So it is well known that the modern title, Protevangelium or Proto-Gospel, is the invention of Guillaume Postel, the French Orientalist, who was very happy, he thought, to have discovered the prequel to the canonical Gospels, discovered them in the mid-16th century in Byzantine Minel and the Synaxaristes. The manuscript titles, however, are very different. Probably the earliest papyrus manuscript calls it the Genesis of Mary, or the Apocalypse of James, or history. Other titles are also known. Most probably Origen refers to it as the Book of James, and this very smart Byzantine copyists called it a book of a certain James. In the Latin environment, it survives as the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew, which is the Protevangelium joined together with the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. And there are more than 140 manuscripts, minuscule manuscripts available according to the half liturgical use of the text. For those who are less familiar with the text, I would quickly summarize what's happening there. So Mary is born to her parents, the pious but childless Jews, Joachim and Anna, at a very late age, by divine grace. The girl is offered to the Temple of Jerusalem, where she's educated until the age of 12 in ritual purity. When reaching puberty, she gets entrusted to Joseph, an aged widower with children. The high priests of the temple assign to her a descendant, because she's a descendant of the tribe of David, curious passage, the task of spinning the purple and scarlet thread for the new curtain of the temple. While she's engaged in her spinning at home, the annunciation that she's going to bear Jesus takes place in two scenes, first at the well and then while spinning. The pregnancy is reported to the high priest, but her and Joseph's innocence is proven by the bitter water test. The Nativity takes place in a cave midway to Bethlehem. Joseph relates a great vision of the stopping of the universe in first person. The child is born in the cave. Mary's postpartum virginity is proved by the gynecological test of the midwife Salome, whose hand withers but will be healed by touching the child. The last part describes the visit of the Magi, the slaughter of the innocents, and the martyrdom of Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, who is killed not by Jews, but by Herod's assassins. Zechariah's death makes the sealing of the temple break in compassion, a premonition of its future destruction. Now, here is an overview of the chapter division, which is used to Fabricius. However, the reason why I'm presenting it here is that one can clearly distinguish between 3 or possibly 4 parts of the account. The first part is the story of Mary. However, there is a subpart of the story of Joachim and Anna, this part of the story ends in chapter 8. Then comes the story of Mary, into which the vision of Joseph is inserted in first person singular. And then comes the divine birth, the visit of the Magi, and there is an additional part, 2 chapters about the martyrdom of Zechariah. And this otherwise very simple, short text, which consists about 4,500 words in very simple paratactic Greek, these identifiable units led the 19th century scholars, primarily Hilgenfeld, Alexander Behrens, and Harnack, to the assumption that the Protevangelium was composed of 3 different texts for the purpose of Mariological piety in the context of the Council of Ephesus in 431. Now, later, the papyri funds of the early 20th century, and then fragments are coming up even recently, unfortunately contradict this assumption, because it seems to be that at an early date already, probably early 3rd century, the text was unitary, and there is no evidence of the independent tradition of the alleged parts. So therefore, a unity is now accepted, although recently George Servers argued for a very complex early redaction history. Now the question is how to explain the motivation for the composition of these quite disparate parts. The dating is more or less agreed now that it's the second half of the 2nd century, and Van Stemvoort's suggestion that it is the Protevangelium is an answer to Celsus' anti-Christian pamphlet, and that the text was probably known to Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen. Eventually, there is a trace in the Epistle of the Martyrs of Lyon that somehow this tradition was available. So, what to make out of the history or account, as the author calls it? It's clearly pseudonymous, not written by James, the brother of Christ. It's not a historical account, but James pretends to be a personal witness of the Nativity. He doesn't really say that, but it can be inferred from the various remarks of the author. So, if it's not a factual history, what is it? It's a normative history, I would call it, what describes what must have happened, not what really happened, but what must have happened. And therefore, there's a purpose behind establishing this kind of credibility. And the method by which it is achieved is the rhetoric of authenticity. So the rhetoric of authenticity, we'll see this in a minute, is that all the language elements and the motives are taken over from the Greek scriptures, both from the Old Testament and some form of the New Testament. So the first claim is that it is not a naive writing. It was rejected as apocryphal in the West by Pope Innocent I, and probably on the initiative or the suggestion of Jerome. It was certainly included in the Decretum Gelasianum. However, in the East, it was widely read, and it had a quasi-canonical status. It was translated into Syriac, Armenian, and many different translations. And ironically, the Protevangelium, despite the rejection, survives in the Latin realm as the Liber de Ortu Beati Mariae and Infantia Salvatoris, as the pseudo Matthew, with the fictitious prologue of Jerome, which I find quite ironic. And so we have seen that the Protevangelium is the foundation for many important Christian traditions, like the perpetual virginity of Mary. We've seen the feasts of the church, which rely on this, and it had a huge influence on homiletics, iconography, and hymnology. So not every apocryphon is a heretical mystery, among them the Dormition of Mary or the Gospel of Nicodemus. So I would compare this situation to the classical Tanakh approach, that there is the central part, which is the Torah, and there is a diminishing authority going through the prophets and the scrolls, and then the Deuterocanonica, and then the parabiblical literature, which is basically the same in the case of the New Testament as well, where the Gospels form the center, and then the historical part, the prophetic part, the apostolicum, and then the other writing, and on the fuzzy edges, for example, the Apocalypse of John, which entered in the East the canon very late. Now, if the Protevangelium is a prose fiction, what is its purpose? Many suggestions have been proposed in the literature. Some called it most handbooks and collections classify it as a childhood gospel. The problem is that it is neither a gospel, nor is it about childhood. It is about Mary. It is about some very important things like the death of Zechariah, and this doesn't form a simple unity. Some suggestions propose that it's a document of early Mariological devotion, or it is a Christian Agada, or a midrash, or more recently, it's a Greco-Roman novel, or an encomium of Mary, or like one of the most recent monographs by Lily Vuong as a praise of ritual purity and virginity. Somehow, in the background, there is the summary statement of Edouard Cottanet that let us not make pseudo-James a theologian. Now, this is what I'm trying to change. I think he was a theologian, but let's see how I can argue for it. So the rhetoric of authenticity is the technique of the well-known late antique genre of the cantron, the cento, which means a literary patchwork from already existing materials. We possess quite a few of these. There is a Latin version, the Versus de Nativitate Domini by Proba, which consists entirely of Virgilian lines, or the Homeric centos, which have been published recently, and in the Source Chrétien, or the Christos Paschon, a late Byzantine pseudo-Euripidean poem about the suffering of Christ. So nearly every single word of the Protevangelium has a biblical ring to it. Actually, only half a dozen words, terms, are unknown, which are not present in the Septuagint. Let's look at one simple example, the very first sentence of the Protevangelium. In the histories of the 12 tribes of Israel, Joachim was extremely rich. He always brought a double offering to the Lord, telling himself, from my riches, there should be for all the people and for the forgiveness of the Lord, Lord God, an atonement for my sins. Now, as the notes indicate, I wouldn't like to go through all of them, but but every single phrase has its corresponding element in the Septuagint or in the New Testament. The second step is to identify another technique, and this is narrative theology. Narrative theology is designed to express doctrinal content in the form of a historical account. So as history in the case of the Protevangelium is not meant to be factual, but it is a normative account, the events that ought to have happened to reify or encapsulate some sort of meaning, has its analogy. For example, in Origen, who, when speaking about the Pascha, says one should not believe that historical accounts are imprints of historical events, and that bodily events are of bodily things, but the bodily are imprints of the spiritual and the historical of the intelligible. But not just Origen, but even earlier Plutarch, when commenting on the Egyptian myth of Isis and Osiris, he says, let these things be said with respect to the story in its common sense. So there is a common sense, and the wiser ones in things divine, they do not call the Nile or as Osiris or the ocean as Typhon, but the totality of the watery principle and might, the cause of generation and that of seed. So there are two levels of the text, two levels of understanding, and he repeats that in a fragment reported by Stobaeus as the Pythagorean principle, that nothing is more characteristic of Pythagorean philosophy than the symbolic. I sing to those who understand, which is an Orphic adage. The oracle's words have meaning and character for the knowledgeable. As Heraclitus says, the oracles of the king in Delphi are neither clear nor hidden, but signifying. So the implication is that if one could read this way, it was also possible to write this way. And the examples would be the Hellenistic novels, as analyzed by Reinhold Merkelbach, Kerényi, or Erwin Rohde. And third, which raises our suspicion, is the number of doctrinal elements identified by various scholars previously. One of them is that the birth in the cave, the birth of Christ in the cave, is a symbol taken over from Plato, deliberately turned upside down. It was first suggested by Ernst Benz and then by Hans Blumenberg, and finally Anthony Meredith in a very nice article collected the variants of this idea of how the cave symbolizes the material world. We'll come back to that a little further on. Another scholar, Van Stamford, identified that the Protevangelium is a kind of apologetic against Celsus, who relies on Jewish charges, which survive in the form of the Toldot Yeshu, about the humble background of Mary. François Bovon, in analyzing in a great article about the vision of Joseph, says that the Protevangelium offers a kind of cosmic vision showing elements of philosophical hue. Nicholas Konstas showed that the weaving of the katapetasma, that is the curtain of the Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem temple, symbolizes the body of Christ, which goes is very much sort of playing on the epistle to the Hebrews. And it is, for example, tangible in the interpretation of Proclus of Constantinople. And one could add that, for example, the suspension of time in the vision of Joseph refers to the contrast of the standing and the moving that goes back to the first distinction of the Timaeus. And this is the context in which the enlightened Gnostics called themselves the immovable race, because they are not changing, and the opposition is between the changing and the changing realm of the material universe and the unchanging realm of the intelligible divine. So, so how to understand, how to find these elements? Once again, Origen can come to help, but also Porphyry, who in his interpretation of Homer in the De Antro Nympharum identifies the criteria for something which requires some second-level interpretation. And one is the unusual or illogical element in the story, introduced without apparent necessity or justification, or an immoderate stress on seemingly trifling points, or a term which is in a clearly significant position that is stressed and repeated. So the contrastive meaning can be found with the help of these specific images, terms, and delimiting markers if there is a counter-narrative against contemporary rival theories. So, for example, that introductory part of the Protevangelium, which we have just seen, Joachim was extremely rich. He always brought a double offering to the Lord, telling himself that from my riches. So why is the richness of Joachim stressed so much? Well, the answer lies in the anti-Christian charges of Celsus, who, based on Jewish sources, says that Jesus came from a rural and needy background. His mother was a day laborer, Hermeneutics, spinning for money. Therefore, Jesus was an amhares, a needy, uneducated person, therefore couldn't be the Christ of Davidic descent. Small wonder then that Mary, his mother, was prone to fornication, and therefore she was easily seduced by the Roman soldier Panthera, a motive surviving in later Jewish literature as well. So Jesus was a bastard. He couldn't really even called Jewish. So when the Protevangelium stresses the extreme riches of Joachim, it is juxtaposed to that charge, that calumny, which was proposed by Celsus. Another very interesting element is, for example, the stress on childbearing. Anna says about her child when she's pregnant, "As the Lord my God lives, if I bring forth either male or female." Joachim celebrates the conception with great sacrifice. "Behold, the widow," says Anna in her hymn, "I, the childless, shall conceive. Who will announce Zerubbabel that Anna has a child at her breast? Listen, you 12 tribes of Israel, Anna has a child at her breast." So this is again a case of a clear stress on a particular element. Now, what is the counter story which it opposes? The contemporary Gnostics denied the importance of having children. For example, the Valentinians, Marcion, and the Borborites in Epiphanius, or in Clement of Alexandria. He says, "It is clear that Heraclitus regards birth as something evil when he says, when men are born, they are fain to live and suffer death, or rather go to their rest, and they leave children who also suffer death." Again, Jesus answered the question of Salome, reported by Clement of Alexandria. "How long there will be death? As long as women give birth." Again, "I came to dissolve the works of the female." Female means the desire, and the works of the female, the generation and corruption. So generation and corruption is the realm of change. It's the realm of the moving. It's the realm of the material and the perishable cosmos. And this is opposed to the unmovable, stable, eternal, divine. And according to the Gnostics, anything which contributes to the generation contributes also to the corruption. Therefore, the way out of this is that the male will become, when the male becomes the female, neither male nor female. So a restitution of the original unity. In the Dialogue of the Savior, which is one of the Nag Hammadi Coptic texts, the Lord said, "Pray in the place where there is no woman." Matthew said, "Pray in the place where there is no woman." He tells us, meaning destroy the works of womanhood, not because there is any other manner of birth, but because they will cease giving birth. Judas said to Matthew, "The works of the womanhood will dissolve. Whatever is born of woman dies." And this is, in my understanding, opposed by the stress of the Protevangelium, of the symmetric role of male and female. There is a strikingly symmetric role of Anna and Joachim in the story. There's a huge stress on fertility, childbearing, and birthday. Mary is of Davidic lineage, not Joseph. Mary dances at the altar like her grandfather, David. The bitter water test is administered to both Joseph and Mary, which is against how it is described in Numeri. And Mary, Elizabeth, Salome, the midwife, are main actors in the Protevangelium. Mary is clearly a second Eve who is not seduced by the tempter against the suspicion of Joseph. And Mary is charged with the preparation of the katapetasma, that is the body of Christ, and gives birth to Christ, that is, Christ is born from a woman, and there is an alternative in the period, namely Mithras born from a rock, the Petrogenes Mithras. Mary gives real birth with birth pangs and breastfeeding. The midwife Salome witnesses the midwife and Salome, witness the divinity of Christ. And the Magi, when they come in, they saw the infant with his mother Mary. So again, together. And the messenger of the Lord is with Elizabeth and the child, John the Baptist, when they are fleeing from Herod. The birthday. It seems to be an insignificant issue, but why is the Protevangelium stresses that Mary's first birthday was celebrated by a great banquet? Again, if one compares it to, for example, Plotinus, who seemed to be ashamed of being in the body, he never disclosed the month or day of his birth. It was because he did not desire any birthday sacrifice or feast. It's just the opposite what's happening here. And again, a solution can be found in Clement of Alexandria. If birth is something evil, let the blasphemers say that the Lord who shared in birth was born in evil, and that the Virgin gave birth to him in evil. They blaspheme against the will of God and the mystery of creation and speaking evil of birth. This is the ground upon which Docetism is held by Cassian and Marcion also, and on which even Valentinus indeed teaches that Christ's body was psychic. They say man became like the beasts when he came to practice sexual intercourse. However, birth is holy. Now, I mentioned the extreme parallelism in the Protevangelium between Joachim and Anna. So Joachim is barren and is barren. Both became very upset. I just put the Greek here that exactly the same wording is used in both cases. Joachim is reproached and is reproached. The great day of the Lord is approaching for Joachim. The great day of the Lord approached Anna. Joachim is withheld from sacrifice. Anna is reviled and banished from the temple. Whether I am the only one who hasn't produced a child in Israel, said Joachim, I lament my childlessness, Anna. Joachim turns to the example of Abraham. Anna turns to Sarah. The angel visits Anna, the angel visits Joachim. So it's a strict parallelism because they perform similar roles. And the same applies to the bitter water test, which according to the description in Numeri and the later rabbinic tradition, was prescribed only for the woman and not for the male. And here it is administered to both Joseph and Mary. And there are other differences as well. But what I wanted to stress at the moment is the parallelism, again, the balanced role of male and female. Again, the reality of the birth is stressed. Mary is pregnant for 7 months. Some manuscripts say 9 months, but it's probably a later correction when the significance of 7, which is a biblical period for somebody who's born with divine intervention. Mary feels birth pangs. A midwife is needed for the birth. And the midwife says the words of Simon, familiar from Luke. Christ reaches out for the breast of his mother. And this is opposed to the Gnostic psychic Christ, who passed through Mary like water passes through a tube, as it is mentioned by Irenaeus. And also in the Ascension of Isaiah, she, Mary, was not born a child, nor has a midwife gone up to her, nor have we heard cries of labor pains. Now, another interesting element of the Protevangelium is its emphatic philo-Judaism. Of course, by employing the Old Testament language, the Greek of the Septuagint, there is an indication of the significance of the Old Testament. But beyond that, it's exceptionally favorable to the Jews. Joachim, Anna, the midwife, Salome, all these main actors are called explicitly Jewish in the text. the high priests bless Mary, and the people approve. The priests raise her in the temple, and the whole of Israel love it. The priests clear her and Joseph from the charge of adultery with the bitter water test. And Israel praises the Lord. The Jews are innocent in the death of Zechariah against the widespread charge that the Jews have killed him. We'll come back to that, which is against a trace in the famous trace in Matthew that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed upon the earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel unto the blood of Zechariah, son of Barachiah, from ye slew between the temple and the altar. Already Origen notices that ye, that is the Pharisees to whom Jesus is speaking, they are blamed. So it cannot be, there is a, actually Luke doesn't add the phrase son of Barachiah to this pericope. So there is a kind of very interesting confusion here, but what matters is that in the Protevangelium, these are not the Jews who kill Zechariah, but Herod's soldiers. The author of the Protevangelium knows about some very specific Jewish lore, apart from the emphasis on ritual purity. The special robe of the high priest, that Mary is born to 7 months, we've seen that, like Isaac. Her life cycle is the same as the rabbinic division of a woman's life cycle up to year 3, and then between 3 and 12, and then beyond 12. Cain is born from the fornication of Eve with the snake. It's a very peculiar piece of knowledge in the Protevangelium. It knows about the bitter water test, we have mentioned, the renewal of the veil of the temple, the bat call, the daughter of the voice, which is the second temple idea for the oracular voice of God. And it's saturated with temple mysticism, with the Urim and Thummim, oracular plate, and many other little elements here and there. On the other hand, this Jewish lore is quite strange, quite ambiguous. For example, it speaks about the 12 tribes of Israel, which is quite anachronistical by the time of the Second Temple. It also mentions the tribe of David. It speaks about the oracular head plate, the petalon of the high priest, which is unknown. What is known is a breastplate, but not the head plate. There were no temple virgins possible in the Jerusalem temple. Hence, no women could have been raised in the sanctuary, even entered the sanctuary. Now, Mary is much more like a Virgo subintroducta in early Christianity, as she is entrusted to the widower Joseph, against which practice St. Cyprian and St. John Chrysostom are arguing, obviously much later, but it's a pre-existent practice. The high priest goes into the sanctuary for oracles, exactly like like into a pagan temple. So the uniqueness of the Yom Kippur entry is passed over. It's not mentioned. And of course, it has a clearly Christian proto-Orthodox agenda, the virgin birth of Jesus, which is a Christological element. Christ enters the world as divine. And it's certainly, in my view, it's not an Ebionite text, which would have stressed a kind of adoptionist approach. So there is an ambiguous Judaic knowledge, probably deliberate, but no more. But more than could be expected from most contemporary Christian writers. However, it has a clearly pro-Jewish agenda, and the author seems to be an anti-Gnostic, pro-Jewish Christian. As time is going on, I would jump over this slide, which is an example of how this kind of ambiguous relationship to the Old Testament is manifested, because Joachim brought a double offering. However, Exodus 30:15, it is prohibited. the rich shall not give more, and the poor shall not give less. So it's I find here that somebody who is so familiar with contemporary Jewish traditions and relationship to the Old Testament text is still playing around or twists to some extent, probably in order to avoid to become too Jewish, right? So it goes to a certain extent, but not beyond. But obviously, this is a debatable point. Anyway, there is an extremely interesting case of the 12 bells. In chapter 8, the priest, that is Zechariah, went into the sanctuary, taking the 12 bells into the Holy of Holies. Why this emphasis on the 12 bells? Why is it mentioned at all? In Exodus, we hear about the ephod of the high priest, but it is decorated with pomegranates, and there are bells of gold, but the number is not fixed. Another passage in the Exodus mentions 12 precious stones on the ephod of the high priest, but this number is not associated with bells. It is known in this way by Josephus, Pseudo-Aristeas, and Philo. The 12 bells, and not stones, are known for Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria. Well, Clement actually knows about 36 bells. And just while working on this topic, I came across this recent archaeological find in the drainage channel of the Western Wall. Whether this is that bell or not, that's obviously a moot point, but I thought it's a very nice illustration of what we are talking about. Well, where does the 12 bells, or the bells in general, come into play? Well, in Epiphanius, Epiphanius reports about a Gnostic writing which is entitled Genna Marias, Birth of Mary. They, that is the Borborites, also took the courage to produce innumerable writings. Among these, they mention a certain book entitled Birth of Mary, in which they spread amazing and deadly lies. In this, they say that Zechariah died in the sanctuary because, as they say, he saw an appearance, and since he was so afraid telling what he saw, he became dumb. They say that he saw in the hour of the incensing, as he offered the incense, a certain human being standing there, as they say, in the form of an ass. As he, Zechariah, left and wanted to say, woe, woe to you Jews, whom are you worshipping? His mouth was sealed by the one whom he saw inside in order to prevent him telling. When his mouth was open, that he could speak, he unmasked it, the one in the sanctuary for them, and then the Jews killed him. Now, here comes the most important bit. They say that Zechariah died in this way. It was because of this that the high priest was ordered by the lawgiver to wear bells. They say that when he arrives to sacrifice, on hearing the approaching sound of the bells, the worshipped one could hide himself in order to avoid being discovered. Now, I see here a very clear juxtaposition between the report of the Genna Marias and the Protevangelium, which stresses that Zechariah did indeed put on the robe, the ephod with the bells. Again, just a piece of illustration, that famous Palatine graffito with the S-headed Christ. I mean, this was a largely widespread anti-Jewish piece of propaganda, probably spread by Manetho and other Egyptian historians. Anyway, what are the common points? Both texts carry the title Birth of Mary. Both contain an account of Zechariah's death. Zechariah is high priest in both, and his robe has bells and not precious stones. it might be that the Gnostic story has a foundation in Exodus 28:35, and it shall be upon Aaron to minister, and his sound shall be heard when he goes in unto the holy place before the Lord. So probably the Gnostics are playing on this passage in order to explain what happened to Zechariah. However, the Gene Marias, as Epiphanius himself says, was a parodistic treatise, parapepoimenos logos. And in the Protevangelium, Zechariah takes on the robe with the bells and doesn't forget it. Whom he meets is a messenger, an angel of the Lord. He does not become dumb. And he's not killed by the Jews, but he's killed by Herod's soldier. And since Herod was an Idumean, and not properly Jewish, according to Josephus at least, and not so therefore Zechariah was killed by a non-Jew, and in the same way as Zechariah the prophet was killed by King Jos, which is this is where the whole Zechariah issue becomes pretty much blurred. Okay, so so the let's just say pass it over, and now the Annunciation and the colors of the veil, because that's a very important element. Obviously, this is where the Annunciation happens. So the meeting of the priests decide that let us make a veil for the temple of the Lord, and let's call the pure virgins from the tribe of David. Again, this is a half Jewish issue. Only Saul Lieberman identified a Baraitha, which mentions the preparation of the new veil, but not by virgins. The katapetasma is extremely important. This is part of the temple mysticism, which is so important for the Protevangelium, because the katapetasma, the curtain of the Holy of Holies, separates the divine presence from the rest of the world. This is why it is so important in the Epistle to the Hebrews that the second veil, that is the inner veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holiest of all, and it is Christ who enters this veil as the new high priest. And then a little later, Hebrews calls the body of Christ the katapetasma, a new and living way, which he has consecrated for us through the veil, that is to say, his flesh. And the veil which is separating the realm of the divine and the rest of the cosmos is quite a popular idea in the period. It's in Porphyry, for example. The ancients said that the heaven is a veil, which is wrapped around the gods of heavens. There is also a testimony about Pherekides, probably a later assigning it to Pherekides later, but it speaks about the peplos of Zeus as a piece of old wisdom. Or the Orphic hymns also speak about the peplos around the world. There's a nice collection of these in Hophius' study. So the priests asked Mary to do the spinning of the purple and the kokkinon out of the two out of the four colors required for the curtain of the Holy of Holies. And while she is engaged in her spinning, the Annunciation that she is to bear Jesus takes place in two scenes. She goes out to fetch water and hears a voice declaring the first Annunciation. Being frightened from the voice, she returns home and puts down the jar with water next to her throne and reverts to spinning the purple thread. And this is at the moment when the angel approaches her. The colors are not innocent terms. We know from Exodus, and then interpreted by Philo, that the four colors required for the four colors of the threads required for the katapetasma, for the curtain, have symbolic meaning. The purple symbolizes water, the scarlet symbolizes fire, blue symbolizes air, and this is white linen symbolizes earth. And this is what is explicitly mentioned by Philo, but also by Josephus. And therefore, it is a kind of cosmic symbolism of the veil. And the purple, as it is also present, interestingly, in Porphyry's De Antonim Farum, which we'll see in a minute, and strikingly similar symbolism, seems to point towards the spinning of the body. And the spinning of the body as a robe is a very widespread idea of early Christian anthropology. Sort of described by Eric Peterson or Sebastian Brock, the clothing metaphors of the body. And again, Mary keeps a jar of water next to her while weaving the purple thread. But water, again, has a symbolic meaning. It's a symbol of change, the ever-flowing waters. In Homer or Heraclitus, one cannot step twice in the same river. That is the river of change. Or in Porphyry, that water is associated with change, while dryness is associated with the unchanging. And this is why Porphyry attributes the saying to Heraclitus that the dry soul is the wisest. Let's see, we've got a few minutes. So, and finally, about the cave. So Joseph found the cave there and led Mary into it. And then the cave is repeated 3 more times in the next few lines. So why is it so important? Because the world, again, in the contemporary context, was symbolized with the cave. Plato's simile of the cave was a common image for the world in the period, in Numenius, in Plotinus, in Porphyry, in Maximus. The cave is the symbol of the material world, the dark and wet cave, which is the realm of birth and change. And actually, it's interesting that in some of the paraphrases, like the Latin pseudo-Matthew, in a kind of Targumic way, it is explained why does the Protevangelium stress the darkness of the cave, because as pseudo-Matthew says, the total darkness where never ever shown any light whatsoever. And of course, the light enters the cave from above. This is the great vision of Joseph. First, the outermost heaven stops, and then the air, and then the people on the earth, and finally the water. Now, if one follows this down, you can see that in fact this is also with the 4 elements. The whole world stops for a moment, and this is when Christ is born in the cave, and then the running of the world reverts to its normal rhythm. And finally, I'd like to call attention to a somewhat later text of Porphyry, which seemingly has analogous concerns. Porphyry is commenting on 11 lines of the 13th canto of the Odyssey. And here he identifies a cave in which there are sitting nymphs next to crateras and amphoras. and the nymphs are weaving the sea purple cloth, and the waters flow unceasingly. Now, what are the common elements here again? The world as a cave, the darkness of the cave, as it is emphasized by Pseudo Matthew when it translates or paraphrases the Protevangelium. Mary is spinning, the nymphs are weaving. The purple, both spin and weave the purple. And the purple in Porphyry's interpretation, he sees a huge cosmic mystery embedded in these 11 lines of Homer. To what extent is it justified is certainly not our concern here, but what Porphyry says that the purple means the body. So the birth means taking on the body as a robe. And the role of the water, Mary fetches water from a well, and then she's spinning the purple thread next to the jar of water. The nymphs are weaving the purple cloth next to the amphoras and the ever-flowing waters. Now, what's the difference? Obviously, Porphyry is not doing the same. It just employs, what I try to point out, that it employs a very similar language. And putting it to an entirely different purpose. For example, in Porphyry, the souls are running through the huge, their cosmic traveling along the heavens, and then the Milky Way, and then coming down, and then putting on another body. So there's a transmigration of the soul and so on. So it has nothing to do, it's a very different theology, which is in the De Antrone Infarum, but interestingly, it employs the same or very similar symbolic language. So as a kind of conclusion, I'd like to suggest that the Protevangelium looks now as a piece of inner Christian polemical narrative theology, written with the help of the Alexandrian technique of the cento, with a two-tier meaning on a surface account, and then a philosophical, theological undercurrent, likely written originally as unitary against the rival theologies of the period. It adopts elements of the conceptual toolbox and framework of the contemporary philosophical theology, sharing a common imagery, but serving different ends. So like a Lego game, that with the same building blocks, you build entirely different things. So the narrative of the Protevangelium is embedded in the lost debates of the 2nd, 3rd century about the role of the Jews, marriage, childbirth, the role of the Old Testament in general, material creation, the genealogy of Christ, and the Nativity. So in that sense, it's proto-orthodox against Marcion and the Docetics. And it's a counter narrative to certain forms of both Jewish calumnies and Christian gnosis. It defends the legitimate Davidic birth of Christ, favors Judaism, but always in a rather ambiguous way, maintains the role of the male or the female, a balanced role of the male or the female, prefers marriage and childbirth, transcendent but real birth of Christ. This is the anti-Docetic, important anti-Docetic element. And it has a Christological program, that the theology of descent and not ascent, the divinity of Christ who descends into the cave, very much against, and don't have the time to explain against, for example, the theology in the Apocryphon of John. So the multifarious theological program explains how the heterogeneous character, literary character of the Protevangelium. It offers a solid theology, so to say, but in a very badly written literary garb. And thank you very much for your attention.